When I graduated from college, I went straight to seminary. Now, at the same time, I started a job over at Dunwoody United Methodist Church. I lived in Dunwoody in the basement apartment of a family with whom I'm still close. My sister was in her undergrad, and my parents still lived in the house that I grew up in. And then they moved. They sold that house, and they left and went to Nashville. I can still remember the last meal we had in that house. Everything was packed and loaded in the truck. We had no silverware or plates or napkins, let alone a table. So we ate our last meal. We had Zaxby's on upside down cardboard boxes. And we sat there on the kitchen floor, ate our chicken fingers, and we looked around and remembered. And then, just like that, the house was gone. I mean, of course it's not gone. Another family moved in and has made it theirs. And I've driven by a few times since then, but it's not the same because it isn't home anymore. Some nights I get pretty nostalgic thinking about that house, thinking about how things used to be, thinking about childhood and easier times and that feeling of home, a feeling that I don't think I've had since then. Maybe you can relate. And this feeling of home is covered with images of fires in a fireplace and Christmas lights, of board games and movie nights, morning coffee, eating at the table together. But surrounding this nostalgic feeling and these images is this awareness that home isn't home anymore. This feeling often hits 20 and 30-somethings, I think, as they transition from one home into making one of their own. But if we're honest, this feeling is present in all of us at different times in our lives. And it can be positive or negative. This feeling that everything has changed. When you bring a baby home for the first time she gets on the bus, dropping a kid off for college, walking someone down the aisle, becoming a grandparent, or a tough diagnosis, the loss of someone who has been there, it seems like forever. Life is surrounded by these moments, joyful and grief-filled, that change everything, and are sometimes followed by this feeling that the home we knew is not the home that is present anymore. Something has changed. And what about now? In the time of COVID, I think we've all felt some sense of this, right? Our normalcy has been interrupted, our routines are upside down, and in some sense, everything has changed. Home is not home anymore. Now, this feeling is present throughout all of Scripture. From the moment humanity is kicked out of the garden to the letters of an apostle in prison to his friends, there is this message communicated over and over again that life deals us with moments that displace us from what we've known, sometimes spiritually or metaphorically, and sometimes physically. And the authors continuously write about or from a place of this home lostness over and over and over again. Psalm 137 is a song wrestling with that feeling of home lostness in a very physical way. We don't know who wrote it, but we know that it was written sometime after 587 BCE, when the Babylonian Empire walked into Jerusalem and destroyed everything that made it home to so many, separating friends and families and interrupting daily life as they knew it. Some people remained in the city, though it was nothing like they remembered, and others were kicked out. They were exiled. They had lost their homes, and I'm sure they were constantly plagued with memories and images of home, of how life had been, of morning routines and Sabbath days and community, but they couldn't go back. So, someone wrote the words of Psalm 137, capturing what it felt like to be exiled from home in the deep home lostness of Babylon. Hear these words. Alongside a river in Babylon, we sat there on the banks. We cried and cried because we remembered Zion. We remembered home, what life used to be like. We hung up our instruments in the trees and stopped playing joyful music. Our exilers, our captors, our disruptors demanded with sarcasm, "Sing us a happy song of home." But how could we sing? How could we make a joyful noise to the Lord in this wasteland? I hope I never forget home. Jerusalem, the streets, the people, the temple. I hope I never forget it. And if I forget you, may the worst happen to me. May my fingers wither and fall, and may my tongue turn black. God, remember those enemies and the destruction of the holy city, the destruction of our home. God, remember the day everything changed, the day the enemies yelled out, "Destroy it all, tear it down." To the ultimate destroyers, Babylon, may there be a reward to anyone who does what you did to us. A reward to anyone who destroys your home. A reward to anyone who displaces your people. A reward to anyone who does away with your normalcy. A reward to anyone who grabs your babies and smashes them against the rocks. The horrors of war were real to the exiles. They had seen everything taken from them, their religious places, their homes, their rituals, their daily rhythms, even their loved ones and their children. Nothing was as it was. And in their hurt and pain and grief, in the midst of wrestling with this feeling that their home was lost, they reached for lament and they reached for vengeance for their enemies. That feeling of deep loss is not that far gone from us now. I spoke with one of our church members this week. She's in a retirement community, and as you know, this illness has caused a great many of these communities to lock down. She told me, "Andrew, I've been through the Great Depression and World War II. This is the worst." We are, all of us, in a state of home lostness, of spiritual and metaphorical and even physical displacement. We are indeed experiencing a kind of exile. There is a collective feeling that the home we knew is not the home we have anymore. And in times like this, it has been incredibly important for me to remember that the majority of this book, the majority of the writing and authorship and the editing and the storytelling in this book took place in a state of homelessness by a people who, for many different reasons, had become homeless and home lost. Did you know that a good portion of these stories, which have been passed around orally for many years, weren't even written down until after the exile of the Israelites? What does that mean? That means that these stories were shaped in a time of asking, how do I function when nothing is the same? This entire book of letters and poems and histories and gospels were formed in exile. And that tells me this: God often does God's best work in the exile. The same God of Adam and Eve exiled from the garden, the same God of Hagar exiled with her son Ishmael by Abraham and Sarah, the same God of Moses leading freed slaves through a desert exile, the same God of the Babylonian captives, the same God of Jesus of Nazareth exiled by the religious power structure and by Rome, the same God of Paul exiled by the Pharisees and his friends and the state. That same God comes to each of us in our own exile. You see, God does God's best work in exile because God is the God of exiles. And just like Hagar and Moses and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Paul and Peter and Jesus of Nazareth, we are being formed in exile. So how has God been forming you, molding you? How has God been working on you in the midst of Zoom and online class and financial hardship and loneliness and loss and death and illness and frustration and grief? What has God been doing in you in the midst of your homelessness? Now, please hear me say that it is more than okay to spend time remembering the past. The psalmist does it, I do it, we all do. We all spend time remembering what normalcy and routine and home used to be. I remember the sound of a full coffee shop, or the sound of a ball hitting a bat and flying into the stands, the crowd going wild. I remember the sounds of collective worship, of singing, of laughing together and crying together. But I don't merely seek to remember. I don't want to just sit in nostalgia. Because if God does some of God's best work in exile, then that means God is doing something in and with me and you right now. And one way God has been forming me has been in the appreciation of things I once considered to be small and insignificant. Things like sharing a cup of coffee with someone, family time, or long walks in the beautiful weather, really asking someone how they're doing, not as a greeting, but as a genuine interest in wanting to know the state of someone's heart and someone's soul. God has been forming me to be fully present and exist not in the past or the future, but right now. God is indeed doing something in me and through me, and the same goes for you. Because God often does God's best work in the exile. We celebrated that last week, the great work God is doing in bringing us together as two congregations and making us into one, birthing a new thing, and in the midst of this time. And if God can do that with two organizations of people in the midst of social distancing and a pandemic, imagine what God can do in you right now. So, how is God shaping you? How is God forming you in the exile?